When my adopted daughter invited us to dinner, she said, "Dad, I want you to meet my birth mother, Natalie." She hadn't told us Natalie would be there, and my husband Robert froze when this woman walked in looking exactly like our daughter Megan, but 20 years older, while Megan stood there smiling like she'd done something wonderful. "I thought it was time you met. After all, she's my real mother." She said real like it was a knife she was twisting, and I'd raised her since she was 3 years old. Natalie walked straight to Robert and hugged him like they were old friends. "I've heard so much about you. Megan says you're the most amazing father, unlike her adoptive mother who's been so cold to her." I hadn't been cold, I'd been the one who stayed up with ear infections and taught her to read and paid for college, but Megan had been rewriting history. "We should go." I stood up, but Megan grabbed my arm. "Don't be rude. Natalie came all this way to meet my dad. She wants to thank him for raising me when she couldn't." But the way Natalie was looking at Robert wasn't grateful, it was calculating. "Megan tells me you're unhappy in your marriage. That must be so hard." Robert looked confused. "I never said that. We're very happy." Megan laughed. "Dad, you don't have to pretend. You told me last week that Mom was becoming distant, that you felt lonely." He'd said that after I'd been working double shifts at the hospital for a month to pay for Megan's graduate school. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." But Megan had already moved on to showing Natalie photos on her phone. "Look, this is Dad at the beach last summer. Doesn't he look great for 45? Natalie touched Robert's arm. "You really do. Megan said you work out every morning. I love athletic men." I watched my daughter feeding information to her birth mother like she was setting them up. "What's happening here?" Megan smiled innocently. "Natalie's been through a hard time. Her husband left her with nothing. I thought maybe Dad could help with some legal advice since he's a lawyer." Robert did handle divorces, but this felt wrong. "She's staying at that awful motel downtown. Dad, you always said we should help people in need. Maybe she could stay in our guest room." I said absolutely not, but Megan had tears in her eyes. "She's my biological mother. She gave me life. Don't we owe her something?" Natalie dabbed at her eyes. "I don't want to impose. Megan just said you had room and Robert wouldn't mind. She said you probably wouldn't care since you're never home anyway. I worked at a hospital saving lives, but apparently that made me absent." "Megan, what are you doing?" She stood up and put her arm around Natalie. "I'm helping my real mother who needs support. And helping my dad who deserves someone who appreciates him." That's when I understood. She was trying to replace me with Natalie. "You're trying to break up our marriage?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Your marriage has been dead for years. Dad deserves better. Someone who puts family first. Someone like Natalie who gave up everything for her children." Natalie had given up nothing. She'd been 19 and addicted to pills when she'd abandoned Megan at a fire station. "She abandoned you. We raised you." But Megan shook her head. "She made a sacrifice so I could have better. Then you swooped in and took me from her." "Nobody swooped. We'd adopted her through the state after her birth mother's rights were terminated. Dad, Natalie loves cooking. She made your favorite meal, the one Mom never makes anymore. It was pot roast, which I'd made every Sunday until Megan became vegetarian and demanded we all stop eating meat in the house." Robert stood up. "We're leaving." "Megan, this is sick. You're trying to set me up with your birth mother?" Natalie grabbed his hand. "I know it seems sudden, but I feel such a connection. Megan's told me everything about you. Your favorite books, your morning routine, that birthmark on your shoulder." I stared at my daughter. "You've been spying on your father for her?" Megan shrugged. "Natalie deserves to know the man who raised her daughter. And Dad deserves someone young and fun. Natalie's only 38. You're 49, Mom. The age gap makes more sense with them." She'd done the math on replacing me. "Plus, Natalie wants more kids. You had a hysterectomy. Dad could have the big family he wanted." Robert had never wanted more kids. We'd discussed it extensively. "Megan, we chose you. We didn't need more kids." But she wasn't listening. "Natalie's been taking care of herself. She does yoga. She doesn't stress eat like Mom. I'd gained 15 pounds during the pandemic while working in the ICU watching people die. She's interesting. She traveled before she had me, not like Mom who's never left the state. I hadn't traveled because we'd spent everything on Megan's education and therapy and activities. Dad, Natalie's lease is up tomorrow. She needs somewhere to stay. If Mom really loved you, she'd want you to help." That's when Robert exploded. He slammed his hands on the table and told Megan this was the sickest thing he'd ever seen. His chair tipped backward and crashed against the wall behind him. Natalie reached for his arm, but he jerked away like she'd burned him. "We're leaving right now," he told me, and his voice shook with anger I'd never heard before. Megan's face changed for just a second, and I saw something that looked like doubt, or maybe fear. But then her expression went hard again. She crossed her arms and told Robert he was overreacting. Natalie stood up and tried to touch his shoulder, but he backed toward the door. I grabbed my purse and followed him out while Megan called after us that we were being rude to her mother. The door slammed behind us, and I heard Natalie saying something about how she understood we needed time. Robert walked so fast to the car I had to jog to keep up. His hands shook when he tried to unlock the door, and he dropped his keys on the pavement. I picked them up and unlocked it myself because he was breathing too hard to do it. We got in, and he gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. "How long do you think she's been planning this?" he asked me. His voice was quieter now, but scarier somehow. I told him months, probably based on how much personal information Natalie had about us. "She knew about the birthmark on your shoulder," I said. "She knew your morning routine and your favorite books." Robert hit the steering wheel with his palm and said, "Megan's been weaponizing our marriage problems against us. She's treating us like we're her enemies instead of her parents." I watched him try to calm down enough to drive. He put the key in the ignition but didn't turn it yet. His hands were still shaking. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes before he finally started the car. The drive home was quiet, except for the sound of him breathing hard through his nose. I kept replaying the dinner in my head and seeing Natalie touch his arm. I saw Megan showing her photos of him like she was setting them up on a date. When we pulled into our driveway, Robert turned off the car but didn't get out. He just sat there staring at our house. "This is our home," he said. "We raised her here. How could she do this to us?" I didn't have an answer, so I just reached over and took his hand. Inside, Robert pulled me into his arms right there in the kitchen. He held me tight and said he needed me to know that nothing Megan said was true. Yes, he'd mentioned feeling lonely, but he meant he missed me during my hospital shifts. He didn't mean our marriage was failing. He said it over and over like he was afraid I wouldn't believe him. That's when I broke down crying because I'd been scared he actually wanted out. I'd been terrified that what Megan said about him being unhappy was real. Robert held me while I sobbed about how Megan turned all my sacrifices into evidence I'm a bad wife. All those double shifts to pay for her graduate school, and she made it sound like I was abandoning him. He rubbed my back and told me I was the best thing that ever happened to him. We stood there in our kitchen holding each other until my tears soaked through his shirt. The next morning, I woke up early and couldn't go back to sleep. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through old family text messages. That's when I realized Megan had been screenshotting everything. There were messages about Robert's work schedule and his favorite meals and things I'd said about being tired from the hospital. I went further back and found texts where I'd complained about gaining weight during the pandemic. Natalie had known about that too. She'd made that comment about stress eating. I got out of bed and went to my closet where I kept my journal on the top shelf. I flipped through it and saw pages that looked slightly bent like someone had been reading them. My hands started shaking. Natalie had known things I only wrote down privately. Things about feeling distant from Robert during my long shifts. Things about worrying he might leave me someday. Robert came into the bedroom and saw me sitting on the floor with my journal. "What's wrong?" he asked. I showed him the bent pages and told him I think Megan's been reading this when she visits. He went down the hall to his home office and I heard him opening drawers. When he came back, his face was pale. "My desk drawers are disarranged," he said. "Some of my papers are out of order." We looked at each other and understood our daughter had been treating us like surveillance targets for months. She'd been collecting information about us to give to Natalie. She'd been spying on her own parents. Over the next 3 days, Megan sent 47 text messages. I counted them. Some tried to make me feel guilty for rejecting her birth mother. Others told Robert he was wasting his life with someone who didn't appreciate him. She sent long paragraphs about how adoptive parents should be grateful when birth parents want a relationship. She said I was being selfish and controlling. She said Robert deserved happiness with someone who put family first. I stopped reading them after the first day, but they kept coming. My phone buzzed constantly with her messages. Then she started posting on social media. I saw it when my friend Sandra sent me a screenshot asking if I was okay. Megan had written a long post about adoptive parents who can't accept their children's need for biological connection. She didn't use our names, but it was obvious who she meant. She talked about mothers who are threatened by birth mothers and fathers who are too weak to stand up for what they want. My friends started sending me concerned messages. Some asked what was happening. Others just sent hearts and said they were thinking of me. I felt sick knowing people were reading her lies about us. 3 days after the dinner, Robert's phone rang while we were eating breakfast. It was his assistant Daryl calling from the office. Robert put it on speaker, and Daryl said a woman named Natalie had come in asking to schedule a divorce consultation. She specifically requested Robert. Daryl thought it was strange she knew so many personal details about Robert's life. She knew what time he usually arrived at work. She knew the names of his partners. She knew he handled high-asset divorces. Daryl wanted Robert to know before deciding whether to take the meeting. Robert thanked him and hung up. He looked at me across the table and said the harassment is following me to work now. His hands were shaking again like they had in the car. I made a decision right then. I called a private investigator I knew from the hospital who'd worked on some cases involving patient fraud. I told him I needed background information on someone. I gave him Natalie's name and what little information we had about her. He said he'd look into it and get back to me. 3 days later, he sent me a report that made my stomach drop. Natalie had a pattern of befriending younger women with family money. She'd gain their trust over several months. Then she'd borrow large amounts of money she never repaid. The investigator found 4 different women in 2 states who'd filed complaints against her. One had gotten a restraining order. I read through the whole report twice and realized Megan wasn't her first target. She'd done this before. I was in the middle of my hospital shift when Megan showed up in the emergency department lobby. The receptionist called me over the intercom saying someone was asking for me. When I got there, Megan was standing by the chairs demanding to speak with me. Her voice was loud enough that other staff members turned to look. She started telling everyone within earshot that I was trying to keep her from her real mother. She said I was jealous and controlling. My supervisor Sylvia came out of her office and asked what was going on. Megan told her I was ruining her relationship with her birth mother because I couldn't accept that someone else gave birth to her. Sylvia put her hand on Megan's arm and said she needed to leave. Megan jerked away and said she had a right to see her mother. Sylvia's voice got firmer and she told Megan this was a hospital and she needed to go now. She walked Megan toward the exit while I stood there feeling my face burn with shame. Everyone was staring at me. After Megan left, Sylvia came back and gently suggested I might need to take some personal time to deal with my family situation. I nodded and went back to work, but I could feel people watching me for the rest of my shift. Robert came home that evening shaking with anger. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and told me Natalie had submitted an official consultation request through his firm's website. She'd filled out the intake form detailing her emotionally abusive marriage. She'd specifically requested Robert based on his reputation. His managing partner had called him into his office to ask why this woman knew so much about Robert personally. Robert had to explain the whole situation to his boss. He had to tell him about the dinner and Megan's plan and how Natalie was stalking him. He said he felt violated all over again having to share our private family crisis with his employer. That night I couldn't sleep, so I scrolled through social media on my phone. That's when I discovered Megan had created a whole narrative about her childhood. She'd posted about feeling like an outsider in our home. She claimed I was cold and distant. She said Robert was the only parent who showed her real love. She wrote about how she always felt like I resented having to raise her. My sister-in-law had commented asking if this was true. Other relatives had left concerned messages. I realized extended family and friends were seeing this completely false version of our family history, where I was the villain who never wanted her. I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling until morning came. The next morning, Robert brought up counseling while we were getting ready for work. He said we needed help processing what Megan had done to us, not because our marriage was broken, but because we needed someone neutral to talk to about this mess. I agreed immediately because I'd been feeling so alone in my anger and confusion. He called 3 therapists that day and found one named Hattie Schultz who had an opening that same week. Our first session felt awkward at first because I wasn't sure how to explain that our daughter was trying to set her father up with her birth mother. Hattie listened without interrupting, and then pointed out something that made me feel less crazy. She said my work schedule and Robert's loneliness were completely normal marriage challenges that every couple faces at some point. She explained how Megan had taken ordinary stress and twisted it into evidence our relationship was failing, when really we were just going through a hard period like any married couple does. Robert squeezed my hand when she said that, and I realized we'd both been feeling defensive about things that were actually pretty normal. Hattie gave us some communication exercises to do at home and scheduled our next appointment for the following week. 3 days later, Robert went to his usual morning gym like he'd done for the past 8 years. He came home 20 minutes later looking furious and told me Natalie had been there in brand new expensive workout clothes. She'd approached him at the weight rack acting surprised to see him and asking if he wanted a spotting partner. He'd walked out without saying a word and driven straight to the gym office to cancel his membership. I watched him pace around our kitchen, describing how she'd invaded even this part of his routine, and I could see how worn down he was getting. Every place he went now felt potentially unsafe because she might show up. I suggested he find a new gym farther from our house, and he nodded, but I could tell he was tired of constantly adjusting his life to avoid her. I decided I needed to confront Megan directly, instead of letting this continue. I drove to her apartment without calling first and knocked until she answered. She looked annoyed to see me standing there. I told her I knew exactly what she was doing, and it wouldn't work because Robert and I loved each other. Her manipulation was only destroying her relationship with us, and she needed to stop before she lost us completely. She actually laughed in my face and said I was pathetic for clinging to a man who clearly wanted someone younger and more interesting. She told me Natalie made him feel alive in ways I never could, and that I should accept reality and let him go. I stared at my daughter and understood she genuinely believed she was helping her father escape from me. She thought she was doing him a favor by replacing his boring middle-aged wife with a fun younger woman who happened to be her birth mother. I left without saying anything else because there was no point arguing with someone who'd rewritten our entire family history in her head. 2 days later, the private investigator sent another report that made everything even worse. He'd found Venmo transactions between Natalie and Megan going back 4 months. There were regular payments of a few $100s and then one huge payment of $5,000 the week before that awful dinner. The note on that payment said investment in our future. I printed out the report and showed it to Robert when he got home from work. We sat at the kitchen table looking at the evidence that this conspiracy had started long before we even knew Natalie existed. Megan had been taking money from this woman while they planned together how to break up our marriage. The $5,000 payment must have been for something specific, maybe to cover Megan's rent so she could focus on the plan, or to pay for Natalie's new clothes and gym membership. Either way, our daughter had been financially tied to her birth mother's scheme for months. Robert called Daryl Cantrell the next morning, and they met for lunch to discuss legal options. Daryl specialized in restraining orders among other things, and he thought we had a strong case. They spent the afternoon gathering documentation of everything Natalie had done, the consultation requests through Robert's law firm website, the gym encounter that Robert's former gym confirmed through their security footage, all the times she'd shown up places Robert frequented. They filed the paperwork that same day and got a court date within a week. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted a temporary restraining order requiring Natalie to stay 500 feet away from Robert, his workplace, and our home. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were actually fighting back instead of just enduring her harassment. Robert looked relieved when he came home with the signed order, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Megan called Robert's phone that evening, screaming so loud I could hear her from across the room. She said he was a monster for getting a restraining order against her mother. This proved he'd never cared about her feelings, and she was done with both of us. She hung up before he could respond, and then sent me a long text message. She said I'd poisoned her father against the one person who truly loved him. When their relationship inevitably fell apart, it would be my fault, because I couldn't handle being replaced by someone better. She said Natalie was the only real mother she'd ever had, and we were both dead to her now. I read the message twice and then showed it to Robert. We had to accept that our daughter had chosen Natalie's side completely, and there was nothing we could do to change her mind. That weekend, I was cleaning out our attic looking for some old tax documents when I found a box of Megan's things from childhood. Inside were journals she'd kept from ages 8 through 12. I sat on the dusty attic floor and read through them with tears running down my face. Page after page was filled with questions about why her birth mother hadn't wanted her. She'd written about feeling different from other kids who lived with their biological parents. She'd asked herself over and over if she was unlovable, or if something was wrong with her. I saw the deep wound that had been there all along, something I'd never been able to heal no matter how much I loved her. Reading those journals helped me understand that her cruelty now came from a place of unresolved pain. She'd never processed her abandonment, and now Natalie was offering her a fantasy version where the abandonment had actually been a noble sacrifice. That didn't excuse what Megan was doing to us, but it helped me see where it was coming from. 2 weeks after the restraining order was granted, Robert called me from his office building parking garage. His voice was shaking, and he told me Natalie had just tried to follow him inside. Building security had stopped her and called the police when she refused to leave. I drove downtown as fast as I could and found him giving a statement to a police officer. The officer arrested Natalie right there for violating the restraining order. She was screaming that this was all a misunderstanding, and that Robert wanted to see her really. The officer put her in handcuffs and walked her to the police car while Robert and I watched. We were both exhausted by the constant drama, but I felt relieved that there were finally real consequences for what she'd been doing. Megan had apparently been waiting across the street to meet Natalie for lunch. She saw her birth mother being put in the police car and started calling Robert's phone over and over. He let it go to voicemail 12 times before finally listening to the messages. In the last one, Megan's voice sounded small and uncertain instead of angry. She asked what was happening and whether Natalie was really going to jail. She sounded confused and scared, like maybe she was starting to see that the woman she'd been defending wasn't who she thought. Robert deleted the messages without calling her back because he didn't have the energy to explain everything right then. That night, I sat down at my desk and wrote a letter to Megan that I knew I'd never send. I poured out everything about the sacrifices I'd made over 19 years, the double shifts at the hospital to pay for her college and graduate school, the vacations I'd never taken because we spent the money on her therapy and activities, the nights I'd stayed up with her when she was sick, the hours I'd spent helping with homework and teaching her to read and being there for every single important moment of her life. I wrote about how deeply her betrayal had cut me, and how much it hurt to be replaced by someone who'd done nothing but abandon her. Writing it all down helped me process that I'd been a good mother regardless of whether she acknowledged it. My worth wasn't determined by her current hatred of me. I'd done everything I could, and that had to be enough. When I finished writing, I took the letter downstairs and burned it in our fireplace, while Robert sat next to me holding my hand. We watched the pages curl and blacken and turn to ash, and I felt something shift inside me. I couldn't control what Megan thought of me anymore, but I could control how much power I gave her rejection. The courthouse hearing happened 3 weeks later on a gray Tuesday morning when Robert and I sat in the back row watching Natalie stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit. The prosecutor laid out her history in a flat voice that made the facts sound even worse. 2 previous restraining orders from families in other states. A fraud investigation in Minnesota, where she'd borrowed $30,000 from a woman whose daughter she'd befriended at a support group for adoptive parents. The prosecutor said Natalie had a pattern of finding families with adopted children and exploiting unresolved trauma to manipulate them. She targeted people who felt guilty about adoption, who worried they weren't enough, who carried wounds she could pry open. Robert reached for my hand when the prosecutor mentioned our case, and I squeezed back hard. The judge set bail at $50,000, which Natalie couldn't pay, and remanded her to custody pending trial. I watched them lead her out through a side door and felt this grim satisfaction mixed with worry about how Megan would take the news. That evening, the local news ran a brief story about a woman arrested for stalking and harassment involving a manipulation scheme with adopted families. They didn't name us, but described enough details that anyone who knew us might figure it out. My phone stayed quiet that night and the next day, and the day after that. Megan didn't call or text, and I told myself that was fine. 3 months after the dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan asking if she could talk to me. Not apologizing, but the tone was different. Less hostile. More uncertain. I stared at those words for 10 minutes before typing back that I was willing to meet with a therapist present. She didn't respond right away, and I spent 2 days checking my phone every hour wondering if she'd changed her mind. Then finally she sent back a short okay, and I let myself feel the smallest bit of hope while keeping my expectations very low. Robert made the appointment with Hattie Schultz for the following week, and we spent those days not talking about what might happen, because neither of us could handle more disappointment. The first session was painfully awkward, with Megan sitting across from us in Hattie's office, refusing to make eye contact while she picked at her cuticles. Hattie asked Megan what brought her here, and Megan said in a small voice that Natalie had lied about several things, and maybe she got caught up in wanting a relationship with her birth mother. She admitted Natalie told her Robert was unhappy when he never said that Natalie pushed her to set them up when Megan thought it was her own idea at first. I told her the lying and manipulation hurt us deeply and broke our trust, that I understood her adoption trauma, but she weaponized our love against us like we were her enemies. Megan started crying and said she knew she messed up, but didn't realize how bad it was until she saw Natalie get arrested. She said Natalie had been so convincing about wanting to be a family, and about me being cold and distant, that Megan believed it even though it wasn't true. But she didn't say sorry, and she didn't fully take responsibility for the damage she caused. She kept using phrases like maybe I got caught up and Natalie pushed me instead of owning what she'd done. Robert asked her directly if she understood she tried to break up our marriage, and Megan looked away and said she thought she was helping him be happy. Hattie pointed out that Megan made active choices to spy on us and feed information to Natalie and recruit her birth mother into this scheme. Megan cried harder but still didn't say the words we needed to hear. 6 months after the dinner, Robert and I were in a stronger place than before, because the crisis forced us to communicate better and remember why we chose each other. We started having coffee together every morning before work and talking about real things instead of just schedules and logistics. We went to therapy twice a month with Hattie and worked through how the manipulation had exposed cracks we'd been ignoring. I cut back my hospital shifts, and Robert made sure to tell me when he felt lonely instead of letting it build up. Megan and I met for coffee occasionally, with careful boundaries and surface-level conversation about her graduate classes and my work. We didn't talk about Natalie or the dinner or what happened after. Both of us knew our relationship would never return to what it was before she tried to replace me. I couldn't forget watching her calculate how to set up her father with another woman, or hearing her call Natalie her real mother like I was nothing. I accepted that some wounds heal slowly and incompletely, that I could grieve the daughter I thought I had while protecting myself from further harm. Being a good mother sometimes meant letting go of the fantasy that love alone could fix everything. Megan was an adult now, making her own choices, and I couldn't control whether she valued what I'd given her. I could only control how much power I gave her rejection and how I moved forward with my life.